In a high-stakes business meeting, two powerful men meet for the first time. One man extends his hand, and the other shakes it, only to have the grip subtly recoil. That moment of discomfort, barely noticeable, ignites a chain reaction. Moments later, one businessman discreetly wipes his hands with sanitizer. What happens next changes everything. A phone buzzes with the shocking headline, Synergy Capital withdraws $3.3 billion from Langston Global. What went wrong? What was the real cost of that single moment? If you love this types of stories, please like, share, and subscribe now. The conference room was cold. Not because of the temperature, but because of the people inside. Polished wood table. Tall leather chairs. A fresh pot of expensive coffee. It was the kind of room where decisions were made that affected thousands of lives, and none of the men inside ever thought about that part. At the head of the table sat Richard Langston, CEO, 63 years old. Silver hair, perfect suit, no smile. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to make money. Richard leaned back in his chair, surrounded by other executives in their 50s and 60s. They were laughing, talking stocks, joking about the old days when they could say whatever they wanted and nobody recorded it. Suddenly, the door opened. In walked a tall black man in a sharp navy suit. Clean-shaven, calm, strong posture. He carried no briefcase, no assistant, no nervous smile. He walked in like he owned the place. In a way, he did. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and even. The room went quiet. The air shifted. Richard turned, blinked twice, then stood. "I'm sorry," Richard said slowly. "Are you with catering?" A few of the other executives looked away. The black man smiled gently. "No," he said. "I'm David Ellis, managing partner at Synergy Capital." Richard froze. David continued, still polite. "My firm holds a 42% stake in your overseas expansion. I'm here to finalize the funding meeting." Now Richard smiled, but it was tight, forced. He stood up, extended his hand. David reached out and shook it. Their hands touched, just for a moment. Then David turned to greet the others at the table. What happened next made the room go silent. Richard took a step back and pulled out a small bottle of hand sanitizer from his pocket. He squirted a large glob into his palm, and he started rubbing. Fast, firm, like he was scrubbing something off. Everyone noticed. One man at the table shifted in his chair. Another gave a small cough. No one said a word. David noticed too, but he didn't turn around. He didn't speak. His back was still to Richard as he greeted the others. He saw it. He heard the squirt of the bottle. He felt the eyes shift. But he said nothing. He just smiled. The room sat in that awkward silence for a long second. Then Richard tried to laugh it off. "Well, let's get started, shall we?" David walked to his seat. Calm, cool, as if nothing had happened. But something had. And Richard had no idea what was coming next. The lights dimmed. A projector hummed. Slides flashed up on the screen. Bar graphs. Market shares. Global maps. Richard took the floor like a man who believed he still ran the room. "Gentlemen," he said, pacing with confidence, "our next move is international." He pointed to the screen. Bright red pins marked Asia, Europe, and South America. "We're expanding. Fast. Thanks to the funding we secured from Synergy Capital." He looked at David, gave a short nod, like someone thanking a butler. David didn't nod back. Richard kept going. "Our factories overseas will be 3 times more efficient," he said. "Labor's cheap. No unions. No noise." David's face didn't change. But his eyes, they narrowed, just slightly. Richard didn't notice. He was too busy showing off. "Oh," he added, laughing to the room, "and don't worry, we'll make sure our partners are comfortable too. Gotta keep up with the whole diversity thing these days, right?" That was it. The smile faded from David's face. He sat very still. Not angry. Not emotional. Just focused. He leaned back in his chair. He tapped one finger on the armrest. Soft. Rhythmic. The room felt different now. Richard looked at him, nervous for the first time. "I mean," Richard stammered, "that's a joke, of course." David stood up. Not fast. Not loud. Just enough to make the room freeze. "I won't take any more of your time," he said. His voice was steady, clear, but there was power behind it. "I came here to see this for myself." Richard looked confused. "See what?" David glanced around the room. His voice didn't rise, but it cut deep. "I needed to confirm that Synergy Capital's funding is being trusted to men who do not respect their partners. And now, I have." One of the other board members shifted in his seat. "Hold on now," Richard said, raising a hand. "Let's not be dramatic." David reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a show. He dialed one number. It rang once. "Pull everything," he said. "All $3.3 billion. Effective immediately." The room went silent. Richard's mouth dropped open. "Wait, what?" David ended the call. Richard stood there, red-faced, stunned. "You can't just pull that kind of money." "I just did," David said quietly. "You don't understand what this will do to us." "I do," David replied. "That's why I did it." And then he turned. Walked to the door. No yelling. No anger. Just grace and power. Behind him, the boardroom fell into chaos. David Ellis stood in the center of that lavish boardroom, his eyes fixed on Richard Langston. The CEO, sitting across the table, had just extended his hand. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like more. David didn't hesitate. He took Langston's hand, shaking it firmly. But as soon as he felt Langston's grip, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just the handshake. It was the look in the CEO's eyes, the way his fingers briefly recoiled when they touched David's skin. It was small. Barely noticeable. But David saw it. And David knew. There was no reason for it. No explanation. But somehow, in that brief second, David Ellis understood. This was not just a simple business meeting. This was a statement. And it wasn't just Langston. David had seen it before. He'd felt it before. That invisible barrier, the one that people like him were all too familiar with. The one that says, "You don't belong here." The one that says, "You're not like us." And in that moment, David made a choice. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say a word. Instead, he took the high road. But that didn't mean he'd forget. It didn't mean he'd let it slide. Because in business, power was often in the hands of those who knew when to act, and when to remain still. David Ellis had seen too many people push back, shout, demand apologies. But that wasn't his way. Not today. He simply walked away. And as David left the boardroom, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. Whispers. Eyes wide. But he didn't turn around. He kept walking. Meanwhile, Richard Langston sat at the table, staring down at his hand. He felt the coolness of the sanitizer on his fingers. He had no idea how long he'd been rubbing his hands, but it felt like an eternity. The moment had passed, and yet, the unease lingered. Something wasn't right. Langston had tried to hide it, the brief flicker of discomfort when David shook his hand. But it wasn't something you could just wash off. And he knew that. But he still didn't know what he had done wrong. It had been a simple gesture. A handshake, followed by the sanitizer. Was that so bad? He told himself it wasn't. But deep down, something gnawed at him. When David Ellis walked out, it was as though the room lost its breath. The silence was deafening. No one spoke for what felt like minutes. Then, one of the senior executives, a young woman named Kate, cleared her throat. "Do you think he noticed?" she asked, her voice shaky. Langston glanced up at her, the question catching him off guard. "Notice what?" he replied. "The sanitizer. The way you wiped your hands after the handshake." Kate paused, watching Langston's face carefully. He noticed. "I think everyone in that room did." The words hit Langston harder than he expected. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He just stared at her. Had he really crossed a line? Had he let his biases slip in a way that was too obvious to ignore? He had prided himself on his professionalism, on his success. He'd worked hard to get here, to this seat, to this moment. He had spent his entire life proving he was untouchable. And yet, one small act of subtle disrespect had the potential to undo it all. Langston rubbed his eyes, trying to focus. The meeting was over. David was gone. The deal was no longer on the table. It was a harsh reality. By the time Langston stepped out of the boardroom and into the hallway, his assistant handed him a phone. The screen showed a notification. Synergy Capital withdraws $3.3 billion from Langston Global. He froze. He knew what that meant. He knew what it could cost him. The money, the clients, the reputation. But what stung even more was that it didn't make sense. David hadn't said a word. He hadn't made a scene. He hadn't even reacted. And yet, everything had changed. Langston went back to his office, his mind racing. He picked up the phone, dialing his top investors. He tried to reassure them. He tried to downplay what had just happened. But his words felt empty. His tone didn't convince anyone. The damage was already done. The world of business is often defined by the things you do in front of others, the deals you make, the negotiations you win. But the real test is what you do when no one is watching. What happens when no one is there to see the moment of weakness? What happens when the truth comes out, hidden beneath the surface, in ways you can't control? Richard Langston had lost control. And David Ellis had silently taken everything with him. In the days that followed, the news broke wide. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the handshake. It was about something much deeper. The press picked up on it quickly. CEO of Langston Global disrespects business partner during meeting. $3.3 billion pulled from company. The story spread like wildfire. Not just in the business world, but across every corner of the internet. Suddenly, Langston wasn't just a CEO. He was a symbol of arrogance, bias, and power used in the wrong way. And David Ellis became something more than just a businessman. He became a quiet hero, a figure people admired for his restraint, his grace, and his unwillingness to accept disrespect. David had chosen not to engage. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't fought. He simply walked away. And the world watched. The story wasn't over. It had just begun. It started with a headline. Just a few quiet words posted online. Synergy Capital withdraws $3.3 billion from Langston Global, effective immediately. At first, it didn't cause panic. Not right away. After all, the markets were always moving. Big firms came and went. But then, the details started to trickle out. A second headline. Sources: executive misconduct behind sudden pullout. That got more attention. Then the one that changed everything appeared on every screen and news alert in the country. Investor walks out after CEO sanitizes hands mid-handshake, $3.3 billion gone in one call. That was the match. And suddenly, the fire was everywhere. It spread across business news networks, then into mainstream media, then across social media feeds. Clips from the boardroom leaked online. You couldn't see much, just the CEO's hand reaching into his pocket, the squirt of sanitizer, the rubbing, the silence in the room afterward. But you didn't need to see more. People understood exactly what it meant. Some things don't need to be explained. By the time Richard Langston walked into his office again, everything had changed. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. Emails poured in by the minute. His assistants looked scared. Even his legal team didn't meet his eyes. He tried to pretend it wasn't happening. He told himself it was just a PR bump, that it would pass. But deep down, he knew better. Because it wasn't just a business decision. It was personal. It was public. And it was powerful. David Ellis hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't called a press conference. He hadn't written a tweet. All he had done was walk away. And by doing so, he'd taken the future of Langston Global with him. News anchors began digging into Richard's past. Old clips of offhand comments. Jokes made at fundraising dinners. Stories from former employees. Things that once got brushed aside as just the way it was. Not anymore. One former assistant said, "It wasn't just David. He treated anyone who didn't look like him like they were lucky to be in the room." Another said, "He never shook the janitor's hand. But I saw him use sanitizer every time he shook hands with our warehouse managers. They were mostly Black and Latino." Those stories hit harder than any business chart. Because this wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about values. It was about dignity. And the public had made up its mind. The markets responded. Langston Global's stock began to fall. First 4%. Then 7%. By end of day, it had dropped nearly 12%. Investors were furious. One sent an open letter to the board. "Your CEO insulted a respected financial partner and cost us billions. What's your plan?" There was no plan. Richard tried damage control. He held a brief press appearance that evening. He stood behind a podium, flanked by 2 PR reps, and read a short statement. "My actions were misunderstood," he said. "There was no disrespect intended." But he didn't apologize. He didn't mention David by name. And worst of all, he didn't look sorry. The cameras caught his face. Tight-lipped. Defensive. He wasn't trying to make things right. He was trying to survive. People noticed. That night, a viral video surfaced online. A side-by-side clip. On the left, Richard shaking David's hand, then using sanitizer. On the right, David walking calmly out of the boardroom, silent, graceful, powerful. The video had one caption. One man shook a hand. The other shook an empire. It was shared over 5 million times in 24 hours. Richard's name became a hashtag. But David's name became something more. A symbol. For every person who'd ever been talked down to in a meeting. For every employee who'd ever been ignored, overlooked, or quietly disrespected. For every young Black entrepreneur who wondered if they'd ever be treated as equals in boardrooms built decades ago. David Ellis didn't shout. He didn't point fingers. He didn't demand anything. He just made one call. And the world listened. By morning, journalists were lined up outside Langston Global headquarters. Not for interviews. For obituaries, Not for a person, but for a legacy. The board met behind closed doors. They were losing money. They were losing face. And now, they were losing faith. Faith in the man they'd once called a brilliant strategist. A man who had built his empire on sand. One board member leaked a message to the press. It was short. Just 9 words. He brought this on himself. We're cutting him loose. That same morning, in a quiet office across town, David Ellis sat behind his desk. The sun filtered through the blinds. His phone buzzed every few seconds. He didn't answer them all, but he read every message. CEOs he'd never met were now requesting meetings. Universities were asking him to speak at graduations. Young black founders were emailing him stories about times they'd been treated like less. He didn't reply to everyone, but he saw them, and he understood. Because this was never just about him. It was about a moment, and what followed. A simple act of silent disrespect, followed by a simple act of silent power. No yelling, no lawsuits, just one phone call. That's all it took. The world had changed, and one man's quiet dignity had made it impossible to ignore. The next morning, Richard Langston's world was crumbling. When he walked into his office, the room was silent. His assistants didn't meet his eyes. His staff had scattered. The door to his office was left ajar. It felt empty, like a house abandoned. A single letter sat on his desk. He recognized the crisp letterhead immediately. It was from the board of directors. He opened it slowly. The letter was brief. Just one sentence. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties at Langston Global. No explanation. No negotiation. No grace. Just the cold reality. He stared at it for a long time. It felt like the floor beneath him had cracked. Richard picked up the phone, but when he dialed, his hand shook. He called his PR team first, then his lawyers. He left message after message, but no one answered. A few hours later, the press conference was scheduled. Richard stood at the podium, facing a crowd of reporters. His voice trembled as he read the statement. I've made mistakes. I regret them. But I want to assure everyone that Langston Global will continue on its path to success. The business will go forward. He looked down at his notes. The words didn't feel real. They didn't sound right. Behind him, the cameras clicked. Every photo captured his face, pale, defeated. The reporters weren't interested in his apology. They were interested in the facts. And the facts had already been made clear. David Ellis had made one phone call, one quiet decision, and Richard Langston's entire career had ended. The public reaction was swift. People didn't just criticize him, they felt betrayed. Longtime shareholders started pulling out. Investors who had once called Langston Global untouchable were now distancing themselves, quickly and quietly. The stock kept falling. By the end of the week, it had lost over 20% of its value. The numbers were impossible to ignore. At the same time, something else was happening. The story had shifted. No longer was it just about a business decision or a slip-up. It was about a lesson. It was about dignity. David Ellis never spoke about the incident again. Not once. Instead, he focused on what mattered. His companies, his family, his community, and the world began to see him differently. Not just as an investor or a businessman, but as a leader who led by example. He didn't ask for apologies. He didn't demand anyone's respect. He simply walked away from a situation that no longer valued him. And in doing so, he left the world a little better than he found it. David Ellis' legacy grew. Companies reached out to him for mentorship. Young entrepreneurs, particularly people of color, sent messages of gratitude. Universities invited him to speak at graduations. One day, a student in a crowded hall asked him, "What would you say to someone who feels overlooked, ignored, or dismissed?" David didn't hesitate. He simply answered, "Know your worth, and never let anyone make you feel small." His words resonated. They echoed across generations. He wasn't just talking about business. He was talking about life. David's quiet power had made him a voice for those who needed one most. For those who couldn't afford to stay silent, but were never given a chance to speak. Meanwhile, Richard Langston was no longer in the spotlight. No one cared about his defense anymore. He'd become a cautionary tale, a man who lost everything in an instant. It wasn't about the $3.3 billion. It was about the trust he had betrayed, and the people he had underestimated. 4 weeks after the incident, Richard tried to reclaim his position. He gave interviews, attended meetings, made public apologies. But it was too late. The world had moved on without him. He'd never again hold the same respect he once did. He wasn't just removed from his position. He was erased from the conversation. And David Ellis? He didn't need to erase anything. He had created something that couldn't be taken away. In the end, it wasn't just about the money. It was about integrity. It was about knowing who you are, and demanding the world recognize it. Richard Langston had tried to wipe his hands of David Ellis. But it wasn't David who was left dirty. It was Richard who had failed to see what truly mattered. David's quiet strength, his decision to walk away, it became a symbol of what happens when you stand firm in your own value. When you refuse to let anyone, no matter how powerful, make you feel less than you are. As the years passed, Richard Langston faded into obscurity. But David Ellis' name became synonymous with a new kind of leadership. A leadership built on respect, on dignity, and on the quiet power of knowing your worth. And if this story inspired you, if it made you realize how important dignity is, and how a single act of quiet strength can change everything, then please like, share, and subscribe to the Storytales. We bring you stories that inspire, stories that remind us of the strength we all have within us. Because every story matters. And so do you.